October 14th, 1944, northern Italy. The mountains were grey ridges under a sky of steel. Fog dragged itself down the slopes like torn cloth, swallowing trees, folding the world into silence. Rain had fallen for 3 days straight, turning every road into a vein of mud, every breath into vapor. And somewhere in that silence, among the rock and chill, a 19-year-old private from Kentucky waited beside a gun that looked too small for the job ahead. Private First Class Merl Callahan crouched low behind his 57mm M1 anti-tank gun, a narrow steel barrel slick with dew and streaked with rust. He called it Little Nelly. He never told anyone why, maybe because giving something a name meant it might outlive you. Around him, the rest of his gun crew huddled in the mud, 5 shadows against a grey morning. Sergeant Al Richmond, 30, Detroit-born, chewing a stub of cigarette that had gone out hours ago. Corporal Max Dyer, loader, big-shouldered, hands swollen from cold. Private Benjamin Ortiz, spotter, Puerto Rican, calm eyes, always searching the fog. Technician 5th grade, Will Foster, thin and nervous, tending the half-track that had dragged the gun up from the valley floor. 5 men, 4 shells that mattered, and 1 strip of gravel road not wide enough for 2 jeeps. They were part of the U.S. 88th Infantry Division, Company Fox, a patchwork of tired faces that had been pushing north since July. The brass called it the Blue Devils Division, but nobody here felt like devils, more like ghosts, wearing out their boots in a war that had turned into a landslide of rain and attrition. The Italian campaign was supposed to be over by summer. It wasn't. By October, Allied forces were still clawing their way toward the Gothic Line, Hitler's last barrier across the Apennines. The Germans had dug in hard minefields, bunkers, machine guns, hidden behind walls of stone. Progress was measured in feet, not miles. In this valley, there were no front lines, only directions of dying. Merl hadn't slept in 36 hours. He had stopped feeling hunger 2 days ago. The cold had numbed everything but his thoughts. His hands were cracked from handling metal, his lips bleeding at the corners, yet his eyes, sharp, squinting blue, were steady. He had grown up listening to the groan of tractor engines and the hiss of welding torches in his father's repair shed back in western Kentucky. He could tell what was breaking by sound alone. Out here, machines still spoke to him, just bigger, angrier machines. He'd learned to hear a tank before seeing it. The deep, steady growl of a Maybach HL 120 engine was different from the lighter rumble of an American Sherman. Germans had rhythm, discipline, even in sound. You could hear it through the ground. And that morning, under the crust of wet earth, he heard it again, far away, but coming closer. Ortiz lifted his binoculars, glass fogging with his breath. "Movement," he whispered. "East Bend. Multiple." Merl nodded slowly. "Panzer force, maybe 5. Richmond spat into the dirt. 5 tanks, 4 shells. Hell of a math problem. "Then don't miss," Merl said simply. The trap was his idea, born out of desperation, and a paragraph from an old British field manual he'd found weeks ago. It described smoke not as cover but as illusion. Baiting the front, they'd called it. Fire smoke, where you want the enemy to believe the danger is. Make them hesitate, make them bunch up, then kill them when they stop thinking. It was madness, it was genius, it was all they had. The Valley of Valparaiso, locals called it a place that didn't exist on American maps, only as a coordinate string northeast of Florence. To the Germans, it was a retreat route. To the Americans, it was a killing ground. The road bent twice through the gorge, forcing any vehicle into single file. On either side, cliffs rose like prison walls, steep enough that even sound struggled to climb them. It was here Merl chose to fight, not because it was fair, but because it wasn't. He had studied everything: wind direction, light, downhill, 3 to 5 miles per hour, good for keeping smoke low. Distance from gun to first bend, 300 yards. Angle of fire, 29 degrees, perfect for a cross shot. He had drawn it all in the dirt the night before, while others tried to sleep. His plan wasn't just to shoot, it was to write, to script, what the Germans would see, what they would think, how fear would move through their formation like a rumor. He whispered the sequence again, like a prayer. Smoke one forward, smoke two deeper, wait, phosphorus, then fire. By 0830, everything was ready. The gun was buried to its axle. Branches and mud disguised its silhouette. The half-track was hidden behind a rockfall in case they needed to retreat. The Brownings, 2 old M1919s, were set up along the ridge to rake infantry if any followed the tanks. The men were silent, waiting inside their own heartbeat. At 0850, the first vibration crawled through the ground. Then came the metallic rasp of treads dragging gravel. The valley itself seemed to tighten, the fog trembling with sound. The panzer column was coming. Merl crouched lower, his hands pressed flat to the earth as if listening through the dirt. Dyer whispered, "Still think your smoke trick's gonna work?" Merl didn't look up. "It'll work if they believe it." Believe what? That they're already dead. He loaded the first round himself, a white phosphorus shell, bright lettering stenciled across its side. Dangerous stuff meant for marking targets or burning out bunkers. Not this. But Merl didn't want fire. He wanted confusion. He exhaled. Showtime. The gun barked. A burst of white split the fog, rising fast, curling, twisting into a wall of ghostly vapor across the bend. Within seconds, the entire road vanished. Even the echo seemed to disappear. The first panzer slowed. Its commander peered through his periscope, unsure if what he saw was fog or an ambush. The second tank closed in, then a third. The column compressed, engines growling in irritation. The German doctrine, tight convoy, overlapping arcs now worked against them. They were boxed in by their own discipline. Merl watched the silhouettes blur inside the white. They were blind now. Blind men make mistakes. "Second smoke," he said. The
We'll
next
hold this
shell
position,
flew farther,
then push through at
bursting
dawn.
deeper in the
Understood.
bend,
We'll
widening
secure the bridge.
illusion. To anyone inside the tanks, it looked deliberate, like coordinated cover fire from multiple gun teams. Radios would be crackling, commanders shouting half orders. Some would want to push through, others to stop. The sound of indecision traveled faster than any bullet. Merl waited, counting heartbeats. The valley was still except for engines idling in the fog. The smell of diesel mixed with phosphorus. His palms were slick with sweat despite the cold. He thought of home, of the hum of tractors on a summer morning, the way dust hung in the light like smoke. Everything seemed quieter there, simpler. He blinked hard and came back to the present. Ortiz's whisper cut through the tension. 5 confirmed. They're holding position. "Good," Merl murmured. "Let them think." He adjusted the barrel slightly, aligning for the first real shot. The crew didn't speak. Even the mountains seemed to hold its breath. He was 19, half frozen, alone with a weapon that history had already written off as obsolete. The German 75mm guns could shred a Sherman at 800 yards. His 57mm barely scratched their paint. But he wasn't aiming for strength, he was aiming for weakness. Tracks, wheels, psychology. He remembered something an instructor had said back in basic training. You can't outgun a panzer, but you can outthink the man inside it. That was the line he carried with him like a compass. At 0902, he felt it, the slight lull in the engine noise. Hesitation. That was his window. Loader heat. Dyer slammed the shell in. Merl sighted low. Tracks only. He fired. The recoil jolted through his bones. The shell vanished into the fog. For a moment, nothing. Then a deep, wet whump. A flicker of orange behind the white curtain. The lead tank lurched sideways. One tread slack, the metal grinding on itself. The beast stumbled. Merl didn't cheer. Next target. Dyer loaded again, breath fogging. Ready. Merl turned the barrel a fraction. Third in line. Aim high. Fire. The second round slammed home. A burst of sparks. A metallic scream. The echo of collapsing steel. The column shuddered again, now wedged tight between burning wrecks and rock. The Germans were trapped, pinned not by numbers, but by geometry and fear. Smoke, rolled over everything. The mountain looked like it was breathing fire. Merl's plan had worked too well. The valley was a coffin now, both for them and for him. He reached for another round. His hands shook. The metal was hot against his skin. Behind him, Richmond shouted orders. "Keep it steady, machine guns, suppress that ridge." But the words felt distant, like echoes from another world. Merl loaded one more shell, aimed lower, fired again. Another explosion. Shrapnel sang through fog. One tank's engine screamed, then died. 3 hits, 2 minutes. The math had changed. And yet, as the noise faded, Merl didn't feel victory, only the strange emptiness that came after sound. He looked at Little Nelly, the barrel glowing faintly, smoke crawling out of its mouth like breath. Somewhere in that chaos, in the blinding haze of white and grey, he realized the valley was no longer just a battlefield. It was a mirror. Every gun, every echo, every decision reflected back at him. He had made the Germans see what wasn't there. Now he wondered what he himself was beginning to see. The fog shifted, curling upward, revealing pieces of the wreck ahead, steel tracks twisted like vines, a hatch swinging open, the black silhouette of a man climbing out, coughing, waving frantically toward the others. Ortiz lowered his binoculars. "They're panicking." Merl nodded once, eyes still fixed on the wreck. "Good. Fear moves faster than fire." Then he reached for the last smoke shell. The plan wasn't done yet. Engines, grinding, steel treads dragging dust, hauling rock, the air quivered with weight and movement. Somewhere beyond the fog, the German column was rising out of the north like a storm fed by diesel and belief. Merl Callahan pressed his ear to the earth and felt it before he heard it, the steady pulse of machinery. 5 distinct beats, 5 tanks, panzer force, maybe 1 command car. That meant 30 men, 2 machine gun squads, and enough steel to flatten the mountain. He lifted his head slowly. The fog was so thick it seemed alive, crawling through trees, swallowing shapes. Good, let it hide him, let it blind them. At his side, Sergeant Richmond muttered, "They're coming early." "Earlier's better," Merl said. "Less Sunday, more fear." He didn't blink, he didn't pray. He just waited for the noise to reach the right pitch, the heavy growl of engines shifting down to climb the slope. The perfect moment when power meets doubt. Dyer crouched beside the gun, breathing through his teeth. "You sure this trick's gonna work?" Merl's voice was low, flat. "It's not a trick, it's theater." He had studied theater once, sort of. Back home, the county fair staged a mock shootout every 4th of July. Wooden saloon fronts, blank rounds, fake smoke. People knew it was pretend, but they still flinched when the guns went off. Fear didn't need truth, it only needed timing. He glanced at the map carved into dirt the night before. 3 smoke points, 1 phosphorus mark, then fire. The valley's curve would do the rest. The Germans would think there were multiple guns. They'd bunch up, trapped in their own caution. That was the plan. The plan was everything. The first shadow materialized through Fog Square, hulking, deliberate. A Panzer IV Aus H, armor layered with skirt plates, turret yawing left and right like a hunting dog. Its engine coughed once, then steadied. Behind it, a second tank rolled in close, treads hissing on wet gravel. A third followed, then 2 more. They moved in perfect spacing, 15 yards apart, formation tight as doctrine demanded. Merl felt his heartbeat match their rhythm. 1, 2, 3 steel heartbeats crossing into the kill box. "Range?" he asked. Ortiz whispered, 280 yards and closing. Smoke. Dyer slid the first round in. The shell locked with a heavy clack. Merl's hand gripped the firing lever. The barrel breathed once, then roared. The shot punched through fog, disappeared, and blossomed into a wall of white heat. Phosphorus curled outward, thick as milk, fusing with morning mist until the road vanished. Sound seemed to fold into itself. The lead panzer halted, its turret frozen mid-turn. Inside that tank were 5 men, driver, gunner, loader, commander, radio operator, trained to believe in armor and discipline. Now they could see nothing. The world outside had dissolved into smoke and whisper. Merl watched through his sights, calm, waiting for reaction. The first radio crackled. The second tank slowed. Formation compressed. The perfect illusion had begun. "Smoke too," Merl said. The second round flew higher, deeper into the bend. When it burst, the valley turned ghost white. To the Germans, it would look like multiple gun positions ahead, artillery markers, maybe a concealed line of anti-tank weapons. The commander of the lead panzer hesitated, unsure whether to advance or pull back. The doctrine said, advance. Instinct said, don't. They waited. Merl could almost hear the tension grinding inside those steel hulls, the human noise under the mechanical hum. Then came the third sound, a scout half-track peeling from the formation, its small engine whining nervously as it nosed forward into the fog. Merl smiled thinly. Bait taken. He held his breath until the scout stopped dead, headlights cutting two pale tunnels through white vapor. Still no fire from the Americans. The Germans began to whisper to themselves, the kind of silence that feels loud enough to break ribs. Merl whispered, "Rear smoke. Make it look like we're behind them." Dyer loaded fast. The gun kicked. Another blossom of haze spread behind the panzer line, rolling downhill like a wave. Now the column was surrounded by its own uncertainty. Forward and rear both blind. The valley became a maze without walls. Echoes bounced between cliffs. Every sound doubled, tripled. The panzer crews began turning turrets at ghosts. Through binoculars, Ortiz saw the first flash of panic, a commander waving frantically, his voice muffled by radio static. "Wait for it," Merl murmured. He could feel the moment tightening, like the draw of a bow. He slid one last round into the breach, white phosphorus. Not smoke, fire. The fog swallowed the muzzle flash, but the roar cracked the valley open. The shell struck a rock face near the front tank and erupted in a cascade of burning particles, streaks of white flame clinging to armor like living things. For an instant, the mountain itself seemed to ignite. The lead panzer panicked. Its driver slammed into reverse, colliding with the second tank. Metal screamed on metal. Sparks cascaded down the slope like molten rain. Merl whispered now. The first heat shell slid in. He aimed low, at the tracks of the lead tank, and fired. The explosion wasn't thunderous. It was deep, like something breaking under pressure. The panzer jolted. One tread went slack, flapping like torn cloth. The tank stopped dead, steam and smoke leaking from its flanks. "Hit confirmed," Ortiz breathed. Merl already had the second shell loaded. The fog made aiming guesswork, but sound told him enough. He swung slightly right, fired again. The shell struck the third panzer just above the track. A flash, a metallic crack, then grinding. The tank lurched sideways, blocking the road completely. 2 down, 3 trapped. German gunners fired back, blind. Shells screamed into rock walls, detonating uselessly. Fragments of shale rained down like hail. The air turned to dust and echo. Richmond yelled over the chaos. "They're boxed, Merl. Keep them boxed." Merl's hands were shaking now, not from fear but momentum. He reloaded, fired again and again. The last heat shell slammed into the fourth tank's drive wheel. The entire formation shuddered to a halt. Engines idled in panic. Radios spat overlapping German voices, confused, angry, afraid, a language of breaking confidence. Merl crouched behind the gun, breath ragged. The valley burned white and grey. Flames crawled through fog like veins of light under skin. He could feel heat licking his face, smell fuel, rubber, human sweat turning to steam. "Cease fire," Richmond ordered. "We're out." Silence came, sudden and unnatural. Only the hiss of burning and the clink of cooling metal remained. Merl's chest heaved. He had just turned 4 shells and a handful of smoke into the destruction of 5 tanks. The impossible, done by illusion. Ortiz wiped grime from his face. "They think we're a whole damn division." "Let them keep thinking," Merl said. Through the haze, shadows moved, German infantry dismounting, stumbling, shouting orders. They were trying to regroup, maybe set charges to clear the wrecks. Richmond signaled the Browning teams on the ridge. The M1919S rattled to life, spitting orange sparks into fog. The echoes made it sound like a dozen machine guns. The Germans ducked, scattered, convinced they were surrounded. Panic spread fast. A panzer crew tried to escape on foot. Another attempted to push the crippled lead tank with its own engine, but the slope was too narrow. The treads spun helplessly, churning mud. Merl watched the spectacle through his sights, jaw clenched. He felt no joy, no thrill, only a strange calm, as if everything had already happened, and he was watching history replay itself. The smoke began to thin, revealing shapes. One tank burning openly, another twisted into the cliff wall, a third, silent but still smoking. The Germans' confidence, their great machine discipline, had turned to confusion in less than 10 minutes. Merl loaded one last smoke round, fired it not for cover but for control. The new cloud rolled across the wrecks, hiding everything again. The Germans shouted, disoriented, believing another gun line waited inside the haze. Some dropped weapons, others froze. Fear had become its own artillery. He could hear the whispers among his crew, Dyer muttering disbelief, Ortiz reciting quiet thanks in Spanish, Richmond's voice rough with exhaustion. "You crazy son of a bitch." It worked. Merl said nothing. His eyes never left the fog. He was waiting for movement, for the counterblow that always came. And it did. A deep thump echoed from somewhere high on the opposite ridge. Not tank fire artillery. German response. The first shells screamed overhead and detonated behind their position, showering dirt. "They've spotted us," Foster shouted from the half-track. "Brace," Richmond yelled. A second shell hit short, throwing mud and stone over the gun. The valley was now an hourglass filling with shrapnel. Merl wiped grit from his face. "They're bracketing. 2 short, 1 long. Next one's on us." "So what now?" Richmond demanded. Merl's mind was already racing. The Germans still couldn't see them through the fog. Visibility was their last ally. "We keep the illusion alive," he said. "Make them think reinforcements are moving in." He signaled to Foster. "Load the half-track's launcher smoke grenades. High arc, left ridge." The launcher barked twice. 2 trails arced into mist and burst on the far slope. From the German viewpoint, it would look like new gun flashes from higher ground. Seconds later, their artillery shifted fire toward the decoy. The next shell screamed wide, exploding harmlessly across the valley. Merl exhaled. "They bought it." Richmond stared at him, half laughing, half terrified. "Kid, you're rewriting the manual." Down the road, the German formation was collapsing. Crewmen crawled from hatches, waving rags, others running into trees. The remaining tank engines sputtered and died. One by one, the sounds faded, no orders, no coordination, just fragments of panic dissolving into fog. When the last echo disappeared, Merl finally allowed himself to breathe. He stood slowly, legs stiff, eyes adjusting to the new quiet. The smoke hung like a memory, white against black, war reduced to contrast. Dyer whispered, "We just stopped a platoon with illusions." Merl answered softly, "That's all war ever is, making them believe something long enough to die for it." The fog shifted again. For a moment, the valley looked peaceful, almost sacred, the wrecks like monuments, half buried in cloud, the air filled with ash instead of birds. The morning light tried to break through, thin and silver. It didn't succeed, but it tried. Merl watched it for a long moment. Behind him, the crew packed ammunition boxes, cleared the gun, checked for the next attack that didn't come. Above, artillery fire had gone silent. The Germans were pulling back, or maybe regrouping elsewhere. Either way, the valley belonged to ghosts now. Richmond approached, wiping his face with a dirty sleeve. "You realize Command's never going to believe this report." Merl shrugged. "They don't have to. The wrecks will speak." He looked once more toward the bend, where smoke and fog still intertwined, inseparable. "They'll call it luck." But it wasn't luck. It was timing. The sergeant studied him for a beat. "You think too much for a farm boy." Merl smiled faintly. That's what keeps me alive. Behind them, the dawn pressed harder through the mist, pale beams cutting into smoke like searchlights on memory. The valley, nameless and forgotten on any map, had become a theater of fear, one act finished, another waiting to begin. Merl turned toward Little Nelly, patted the warm steel of its barrel. "Rest now," he whispered. "The next scene's yours too." The sound of wind returned, dragging dust through silence. Somewhere beyond the ridge, another engine rumbled a faint new heartbeat in the fog. The war wasn't over, not yet. The smoke thinned, but the illusion lived on. The fog was burning. Not in color, there was no color left, but in light. White on gray, smoke on smoke, a slow collision between illusion and reality. The quiet that followed Merl's last shot was the kind that hurt the ears. Every sound dripping oil, crackling wire, a tank's dying breath was too sharp, too close. Then, somewhere ahead, a hatch opened. A figure climbed out of a crippled panzer, helmet dented, sleeve torn, body jerking like a puppet half awake. He stumbled through the haze, coughing, eyes wide. The man turned once toward what had been his command and vanished back into the fog. Merl Callahan didn't move, his cheek pressed to the gun shield, his pulse still hammering from the last recoil. His eyes were raw from smoke, but he kept them open, locked on the road ahead. He had been trained to expect counterfire. Instead, he heard confusion, a dozen German voices overlapping, shouting directions no one followed. Richmond crouched beside him, voice low. "You broke their rhythm." Merl didn't look away. "No, I made them listen to the wrong song." The air changed again. The smoke wasn't drifting now, it was crawling, clinging to the road like a living thing. Flames inside the first panzer glowed faintly, feeding on spilled fuel. The valley's silence turned into a kind of breathing. The war, for a few minutes, had a heartbeat. Ortiz shifted on the ridge, binoculars pressed to his face. Movement north side. Infantry, maybe engineers. They're setting charges to clear the road. Richmond spat. "We stop that, or they'll free the tanks." Merl didn't hesitate. "Give me smoke. One left?" Dyer nodded, hand trembling as he loaded. Merl adjusted elevation, fired. The shell shrieked through air and burst low, spreading another white bloom across the wrecks. For a second, the world turned blind again. The German engineers vanished in the swirl. When the smoke thinned, they were gone, scattered or dead. No one could tell. From far up the slope, a new sound tore through the quiet, a heavy, deliberate thump. Artillery. Merl knew it instantly. 88, he said. "They're bracketing us." A second later, the first shell landed long, slamming into the valley wall behind them. The concussion rolled through the ground, a deep gut punch of noise. Dirt rained down. The crew hit the earth. Another shell followed short this time. Closer. "They're finding range," Richmond shouted. "We have to move." But Merl was already thinking faster than fear. He could feel the pattern, long, short, correction. The next one would be right on top of them. He turned to Foster. "Half-track smoke launchers. Fire everything you've got." The driver didn't argue. The small mortars on the half-track side spat white arcs into the air. Clouds erupted across the slope, drifting high, curling like broken wings. The next German shell whined overhead, detonating beyond the ridge, wrong range. The smoke had tricked them again. Merl smiled just barely. The same tactic that fooled tanks was now confusing gunners. "Keep them guessing," he said. "That's how we stay alive." But staying alive was only part of it. Something deeper had started to stir inside him. The plan had worked. The illusion had become real. Yet what came next, this strange quiet, this fragile moment between survival and guilt, felt heavier than victory. The fog opened slightly. Through it, Merl saw what they had done. 5 tanks littered the valley floor, each a monument to precision and panic. One burned, its turret peeled like fruit skin. Another lay on its side against a cliff, wheels spinning slow as clock hands. Bodies moved among them, small, fragile movements, men dragging the wounded out, some kneeling, some not rising again. Merl watched, expression unreadable. Dyer said softly, "They're finished." "No," Merl replied. "They're deciding what finished means." He could hear the Germans shouting again, calling for help that wouldn't come. Radios were dead, antennas snapped, smoke choking the airwaves. The war had collapsed to a single valley. Then, a shot cracked through fog rifle fire. Close. A bullet hit the gun shield, sparking. Richmond ducked. Sniper. Merl didn't flinch. He rotated the gun slightly toward the sound, though the barrel was empty now. The gesture was enough. 2 more shots fired. Wild, panicked, then silence. Ortiz's voice came through again from the ridge. "They're breaking, running north into the trees." "Let them," Richmond said. "We're not chasing ghosts." Merl lowered his hands from the gun, finally exhaling. His fingers were black with soot, his knuckles raw. He looked at them as if they belonged to someone else. The world had slowed to a crawl. Smoke coiled upward in long, lazy strands, merging with the clouds. Somewhere behind them, an Allied artillery battery fired in the distance, a faint reminder that the war beyond this valley still existed. But here, time had stopped. Merl stood. The gun's barrel was hot enough to shimmer. He laid a hand on it gently, like closing the eyes of a friend. "Little Nelly," he whispered, "you did your job." Foster approached, voice shaking. "That was the last shell, sir. We're dry." "Good," Merl said. "Means we won't waste them." He looked toward Richmond. The sergeant's face was streaked with dirt, his cigarette burned to the filter. "We radioing this in?" "Already did," Richmond said. "HQ thinks we're exaggerating. They're sending a patrol to confirm." Merl smirked. "They won't find much left to confirm." He started walking slowly toward the bend, boots sinking into wet gravel. The others followed, weapons low. The closer they got, the clearer the wreckage became. A panzer's steel flank lay ripped open, its interior blackened, melted like wax. Another tank had fused into the road itself, tracks buried in asphalt. A body leaned half out of a hatch, eyes open, staring at nothing. Merl stopped beside it. He didn't look away. The man couldn't have been older than 22. A small photograph was pinned inside the tank. 2 children, a farmhouse, smiling faces. Dyer joined him, silent. "You ever think about who's in there?" he asked. Merl nodded slowly. "Every time. Does it help?" "No, but it keeps me honest." They stood there for a moment, the only sound, the pop of burning fuel. Then Richmond's voice called out from behind, "Merl, you need to see this." He turned. A German soldier was kneeling in the mud, hands raised, helmet off. His face was streaked with oil and fear. Behind him, 2 more emerged from the fog. Then another. In minutes, more figures appeared, stumbling, limping, dropping weapons as they came. 20 men in all. None resisted, none spoke. They moved like sleepwalkers through the smoke. Richmond exhaled. "Jesus, they're surrendering," Ortiz muttered. "They think we've got an army hiding up there." Merl looked around at his 4 men, at the empty ammo crate, the smoking gun, the mud, the silence. "Maybe we do," he said. The surrender came quietly. No cheering, no speeches. The Germans placed their weapons in a pile, MP-40s. Lugers, 1 Panzerfaust still clean. They stood with their hands above their heads, eyes lowered. Some glanced at Merl, curious. He didn't look like an officer, but they understood. He was the one who had made this happen. Richmond organized the prisoners, moving them toward the road where the Allied patrol would arrive. Merl stayed back, still beside Little Nelly. The gun looked smaller now, almost harmless. He thought of the plan, of how every choice, wind, direction, distance, timing, had lined up like gears in a watch. He had built the illusion, and they had walked right into it. Yet the victory felt strange, hollow at the edges. Ortiz approached, eyes thoughtful. "You know, back home, they'll write about this like it was luck." Merl shook his head. "Luck doesn't think." "What does?" Merl glanced at the valley around them, still filled with smoke, as if the war itself refused to vanish. "Fear," he said. "Fear thinks for everyone." He turned toward the horizon. The fog was lifting slowly, revealing the jagged ridges of the Apennines in brittle light. Far above, the sun broke through a seam in the clouds, thin, pale, hesitant. For the first time in hours, color seemed possible again. Behind him, the men were laughing softly, the laughter of exhaustion, of disbelief. Richmond tossed his empty helmet onto the ground and let out a bark of relief. Dyer slumped beside the gun, hands still shaking. Ortiz sat on a rock, head tilted toward the light. Merl stood apart, watching the smoke drift upward. He knew this quiet wouldn't last. The war would move on, always uphill, always forward. But for this moment, in this unnamed valley, they had stopped something bigger than themselves, not with brute strength, but with thought, with timing, with smoke. He walked over to the nearest panzer wreck and touched its scorched armor. The metal was warm, humming faintly like a dying animal. He felt no hatred, only understanding. Machines didn't wage war, men did, and men were always convinced they could control what they built, until it burned them back. He looked at his reflection in the blackened steel, a ghostly outline, blurred by soot and flame. For a heartbeat, he saw two faces, his and the German commander's, the same exhaustion, the same fear. Different sides of the same illusion. Richmond called out from behind, "They're ready to move, Merl. Patrols inbound." Merl nodded, but his gaze stayed fixed on the smoke. "Tell them to wait. I need one last look." He climbed a few steps up the ridge. From there, the whole valley lay beneath him, wrecked tanks, broken trees, trails of white smoke still curling through the grey. It looked almost peaceful, like a photograph waiting for a caption no one would read. He closed his eyes. The sound of the battlefield faded, replaced by something quieter: wind through trees, the faint ring in his ears, the echo of his own heartbeat. He thought of home again, the tractor engine, the fields after rain, the idea that even the smallest man, in the smallest valley, could change the rhythm of a war not by power, but by perception. He opened his eyes. The smoke was thinning now. Light crept down the slopes, touching every scar, every twisted shape, every face. The valley looked washed clean, though nothing was. Merl turned back toward his men. "Let's go," he said. "The fog's done its job." They gathered their packs, their empty shells, their disbelief, and started down the road. The prisoners followed in silence. Behind them, the wreck still smoked, whispering back their last heat to the mountains. Somewhere far above, artillery thundered again, distant, rhythmic, relentless. The war had moved on, but the valley of Valpeso would stay behind, invisible on any map, remembered only by those who had seen how smoke could turn to fire and fear could turn to victory. For a brief, impossible morning in 1944, 5 men and 1 gun had rewritten the laws of war. And in that grey silence, beneath the weight of history, the world had learned a truth it would forget too soon. That sometimes the sharpest weapon on the battlefield is not the shell that kills, but the mind that decides when not to fire. For 10 full minutes, the valley forgot what sound was. Only smoke moved, dragging dust, swallowing edges, curling against rock. The world had turned grey, shapeless, weightless. Then, somewhere beyond the northern ridge, thunder returned. Not thunder, artillery. The first shell tore the silence open like a blade. It struck high on the slope, showering slate and pine needles, echo rolling down the valley like an animal's roar. The second came closer, short, low, biting through the fog. Men dropped flat, pressing faces to mud that smelled of iron and rain. Merl Callahan didn't flinch. His hands were already on the gun, body instinctively between steel and sky. He counted seconds between impacts: 5, 7, correction, fire, incoming. "They've got range," he said. Richmond shouted over the echo, "They're walking it down the line." "Not yet," Merl answered. "They're guessing." Another shell screamed, whistling like torn metal in wind. It hit short front of the gun position, splintering earth, scattering gravel across Merl's face. The concussion slammed his chest. air bursting from his lungs. He forced himself up, eyes stinging. They can't see us. They're blind, firing into smoke. Ortiz crawled up the ridge with binoculars. Still fogged in, can't spot muzzle flashes. They're using sound. Then give them more to hear. Foster understood immediately. He swung the half-track around, engines howling. The noise bounced off cliffs, feeding confusion. From across the valley, the Germans heard what they thought was armor repositioning. They adjusted fire again, overshooting. The third salvo screamed over their heads and exploded far behind them. Merl allowed himself a dry grin. They're chasing ghosts, but ghosts could die too. The ridge above them was shaking. Each detonation brought stones rolling, small at first, then larger, an avalanche fed by percussion. A chunk of hillside broke loose, crashing down just 20 yards from the gun. Branches snapped, mud spattered. Jesus, Dyer coughed, wiping dirt from his eyes. We'll get buried before we're hit. Merl spat blood and rain. Keep the gun covered. We're not done yet. He scanned the haze. The German tanks they had crippled still smoldered below, but the noise of artillery was masking another sound, lighter engines, mechanical chatter, the cough of new gears, reinforcements, maybe reconnaissance half-tracks, maybe a fresh armored unit trying to retake the pass. Richmond crawled beside him. We stay, we die, we move, we lose the position. Pick your poison. Merl didn't answer. His mind ran like machinery, measuring terrain, echo, timing. They think they're hitting our line. We'll make them believe it's working. Then we pull. He grabbed the field phone wire leading back to Foster's half-track. Cut connection after 3 minutes. Smoke launchers, pattern 5-4-2. Foster hesitated. That'll empty everything. That's the point. 3 minutes later, the half-track's launchers barked in rhythm. 5 shells left ridge, 4 right, 2 center. White clouds burst across the mountainside, curling down like waterfalls of mist. From the German vantage point, it looked like retreat cover. They would advance to finish it. Now, Merl said, we let them come to an empty stage. The gun crew worked like clockwork. They dragged camouflage netting over the M1, packed remaining smoke casings, and hauled ammunition crates down the ravine one by one. The valley filled with shifting whiteness, shapes dissolving into it. By the time the Germans advanced, the Americans were ghosts again. Down the road, the counterstrike began. 2 German half-tracks rolled forward through the wreckage, followed by a single panzer that had managed to restart. The engine roared, dragging treads through fire and ash. Around it, soldiers moved in jerks, silhouettes flaring in the mist, weapons up, nerves raw. They fired into smoke, bullets cutting only air. Their voices were high, urgent, feeding on fear. They believed an entire American company was still in the valley. The illusion had outlived its creator. From the ridge above, Merl's team watched through binoculars. The Germans were moving exactly as he'd predicted, tight formation, guns scanning the wrong angles, convinced they were surrounded. Let them have it, Richmond growled. Merl shook his head. No ammo. Let their own panic burn them. He was right. The first panzer hit one of its own disabled wrecks, misjudging distance in the fog. The collision sparked a brief fire, igniting spilled fuel. Within seconds, flames climbed the hull. Another crew shouted warnings too late. The fire leapt tank to tank, devouring oxygen, feeding itself. The counterstrike collapsed before it began. By mid-morning, artillery fire had ceased. The mountain settled into uneasy quiet. Smoke clung low, unwilling to leave. Merl and the crew crawled back to the gun. The M1 sat half-buried under mud, but intact, barrel still black with heat. He brushed a hand along it, the way a man checks a horse after a hard ride. She's still breathing, he said softly. Ortiz scanned the road. Movement stopped, no more engines. Richmond lit a crushed cigarette with shaking fingers. Means they're gone or dead. Both, Merl said. He knelt behind the gun shield again, looking down the valley where shapes were beginning to solidify as the fog thinned. The wrecks looked unreal, 5 twisted machines, half submerged in smoke. Between them lay the German dead. their uniforms ash-colored, indistinguishable from mud. No one spoke for a long while. The war had shrunk to silence. Finally, Dyer muttered, "This can't be it. Feels too quiet." Merl's voice was low. "Quiet's just the sound of someone else's turn." He was right again. Far off, beyond the next ridge, faint engines rumbled American this time. The patrol Richmond had radioed earlier was arriving. When they appeared, 5 jeeps and a medical truck crawling up the slope, their headlights cut through the remaining fog like knives. The men inside stared at the scene, jaws set. None had expected what they saw, an entire German armored platoon wiped out by one small crew and a single 57mm gun. The patrol leader stepped out, mud up to his knees, helmet cocked back. "Who the hell did this?" Richmond nodded toward Merl. "Him and that gun." The lieutenant looked at the wreckage again, disbelief carved into his face. "You mean to tell me 5 tanks, 2 half-tracks, 20 men?" 22, Merl corrected quietly. "We counted." The lieutenant just whistled. "You boys just made history." Merl looked at the valley and said, "No, sir, we just made smoke." As the patrol began processing prisoners and gathering bodies, the crew drifted apart, each man alone with his thoughts. Dyer sat on an ammo crate, staring at his blistered hands. Ortiz helped medics carry the wounded. Foster leaned against the half-track, eyes half-closed, murmuring a prayer he couldn't finish. Richmond found Merl standing by Little Nelly again, staring down its length toward the bend where everything had begun. The sergeant approached quietly. "You did good," he said. Merl didn't answer. His voice, when it came, was distant. "You ever wonder what happens after something like this?" "Yeah," Richmond said. "You pack up and do it again tomorrow." Merl shook his head. "No, I mean, inside. You build something to survive. You start believing the plan, the smoke, the lies you make for the enemy, but after a while, you start living in them yourself." Richmond looked at him for a long moment, then clapped his shoulder. "You think too much for a soldier." Merl gave a thin smile. "That's why I'm still alive." They turned as the patrol's photographer arrived, standard procedure for after-action reports. The man unpacked a bulky camera, tripod, flash bulbs. He looked uncomfortable, as if afraid to disturb the air. "Mind if I get a shot of the crew?" he asked. Richmond shrugged. "Go ahead." They stood together beside the gun, 5 figures framed against fog and wreckage. The photographer adjusted focus, counted down, and took the picture. The flash cut through smoke like lightning white, brief, absolute. When it faded, everything looked darker again. That photo would later vanish into archives, catalogued, misfiled, forgotten. No headlines, no citations, just a picture of boys pretending they weren't broken. By afternoon, the valley began to clear. Sunlight crawled slowly over the ridge, revealing what the smoke had hidden: scars of battle, blackened trees, the thin stream below, choked with ash. The medics finished their work. The prisoners sat in a quiet line beside the road, faces hollow, eyes fixed on nothing. Merl walked past them, helmet in hand. One of the Germans looked up young, maybe his age, lips trembling as he whispered something in his own tongue. Merl didn't understand the words, but he recognized the tone. It wasn't anger, it was disbelief. He stopped for a moment, studying the man. Then he said softly, almost to himself, "We were both fed by belief." He moved on. The order came down at dusk. Pull back, regroup at the next village. The war would continue north toward Bologna. Another valley, another map coordinate, another nameless fight. The crew hitched the gun to the half-track. Mud sucked at the tires as they turned down the road. Behind them, the valley of Alpeso smoldered quietly, smoke rising in thin columns that twisted like memory. Merl looked back once, then forward again. The road ahead was narrow, lined with the skeletons of trees stripped bare by shellfire. The air still smelled of burnt oil and wet stone. He felt the weight of silence pressing in, heavier than the sound of engines. Richmond leaned out from the half-track cab. "You gonna write this down someday?" Merl said. "No one would believe it." "Then tell it." Merl looked at him. Maybe. When the smoke's gone. The vehicle climbed the last bend. Behind them, the valley disappeared into fog once more, reclaimed by the same silence that had started it all. Years later, the historians would call battles like this minor engagements, footnotes in the long crawl up the Italian peninsula. The maps would show arrows and numbers, not faces. But for one day in 1944, in a nameless valley cut from rock and weather, 5 men used smoke, silence, and instinct to turn chaos into order, and then watch that order collapse again. The fog had hidden everything: fear, courage, guilt, faith. But as it lifted, it left behind something no artillery could erase, the quiet proof that even the smallest act of thought can echo louder than guns. Merl Callahan would never see himself as a hero. He would go on fighting, one valley after another, until the war finally ran out of roads. But somewhere deep in the grey folds of memory, the valley of Valparaiso would remain the place where illusion became weapon, where fire was born from fog, and where a boy from Kentucky learned that victory and ruin could look exactly the same in black and white. The smoke had turned to fire. Now the fire was fading to memory.